Thank you very much, Maggie, and good afternoon. My name is Christine Kirby. I am the Assistant Commissioner of the Massachusetts Department of Environmental Protection, the Bureau of Air and Waste. And I'm very pleased to welcome you today to MassDEP's fourth stakeholder meeting session to continue to gather your input into developing new provisions for including cumulative impact analyses, sometimes called CIA, into certain categories of air permits. This meeting continues the important process for the Commonwealth and MassDEP, and we want to ensure that all stakeholders with an interest in the regulations we eventually propose and adopt are engaged in the process. Next slide. So I wanted to review the agenda. The goal of today's meeting is to present information to you and to obtain your feedback and input on those indicators you think should be considered in a cumulative impact analyses and in our process. So indicators are grouped into three general categories, as you will hear in the presentation, and include environmental, health, and socioeconomic and demographic indicators. As you can see in the agenda, we will review these different categories of indicators, the process for evaluating the indicators, and finally, we hope to have a robust discussion on the potential indicators to consider. Next slide. So we want to show where we are in the process. The slide shows that. MassDEP started holding monthly stakeholder meetings this past August, and we are planning to release conceptual models for discussion by early next year and conceptual drafts of the regulation by spring that MassDEP will ultimately propose. And then we will be proposing regulations by October of 2022. This stakeholder meeting has combined the subject matter we had planned for November and December, so we will not be holding stakeholder sessions in December. Just wanted to let people know that, and we'll be back in January with an additional round of sessions. So we will be canceling our December meeting. We'll update our website, and we'll continue with our planned meeting in January. Just want to quickly note, as we've done in past meetings, MEPA, or the Massachusetts Environmental Policy Act, has separate requirements under the climate law and is under a tighter time frame of the regulations they are working on, and those are due by the end of this year. And many of you probably already know MEPA released draft regulations which are available for comment, and you can find those drafts on the MEPA website, and the website will be provided the link to it later in today's presentation. So of note, MassDEP's concepts for cumulative impact analyses, we may utilize the same data and concepts as MEPA, so we're going to continue to coordinate our respective processes throughout the next year on this process. Next slide. I wanted to cover the purpose of today's meeting. The purpose is to discuss which indicators should be evaluated in a cumulative impact assessment or analysis. And we're very much interested in brainstorming the list of indicators with you and get your feedback. We will stop and ask questions along the way. So we want to make sure we hear from everyone that's interested in giving us their feedback. Next slide, please. So throughout the presentation, we are asking that you keep in mind three main questions. First, what indicators did we miss? Second, what indicators do you think are not needed? And third, based on your experience with projects or actions in your community, what indicators do you see as being of particular importance for this effort and for cumulative impact analysis? We're going to come back to these questions at a few times during our presentation, and we would like to discuss the ideas raised by them. And we're hoping that they will help you formulate your questions or comments that would help you to participate in the dialogue today and going forward. Again, as we've said in past meetings, we have reached out to the environmental stakeholder community, municipalities, the regulated community, environmental and business organizations, and particularly environmental justice communities or communities with environmental justice populations and organizations to participate in this important process. And again, we're very happy and glad that you are here today with us, and we have a good turnout, so we're pleased by that. We appreciate your engagement and partnership in exploring this really complex topic of including cumulative impact analysis in the air permitting process. And thank you very much for your participation. And I'll now turn it over to Lisa McDonald from APT. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Lisa McDonald, and I'm the project manager from the APT Associates project team that's helping MassDEP develop a cumulative impact assessment for air permitting. Myself and two of my colleagues will be presenting some information on indicators that we are considering as part of the CIA. Next slide, please. Before we get started with some information on those indicators, I wanted to go over two important definitions. The first definition is stressors. And stressors are chemical, physical, biological, social, economic, or demographic parameters that may cause adverse impacts to human health. Chemical stressors are hazardous substances that, when released to the environment, may cause harm. Physical stressors are non-chemical stressors, such as noise or temperature, that may also cause harm, while biological stressors are different agents that may cause impacts to human health, such as disease. Social economic stress is caused by specific social and economic situations, such as struggling to pay bills or struggling to feed your family. Demographic composition can also affect stress for people impacting human health. Because it's often difficult to measure stressors directly, we often use indicators that indirectly assess different types of stressors and may cause adverse impacts to human health. Today, we'd like to discuss the indicators that we have been considering for inclusion in the CIA and also hear your suggestions for additional indicators to evaluate. Next slide, please. When we started this process, we first started to look at other states and the federal government and what they were doing in terms of developing indicators, specifically for identifying overburdened and stressed or vulnerable populations. Two states in particular that we found most relevant are California and New Jersey. And we've actually presented some information on these two states in the second stakeholder meeting. And if you're interested in looking at those slides, they are posted currently on the MassDEP website, and there will be a link at the end of this presentation if you'd like to go back and take a look at those. For the California, they have developed a California Cal Enviro screen, which identified 21 indicators that assess pollution burden, including exposures and environmental effects, and population characteristics, including sensitive populations and social economic factors. Its data is available at the census tract level, and it rolls up its indicator data to provide a composite score for each census tract, which it then compares to other census tracts throughout the state. New Jersey is a little bit farther behind California and are in the initial stages of developing its rules to meet the new environmental justice law that was passed in September of 2020. The law requires New Jersey Department of Environmental Protection to evaluate the contribution of certain facilities to existing environmental and health stressors in overburdened communities. It has developed a list of 31 indicators that are evaluated at the block group level. It's worth noting that initially New Jersey identified over 60 indicators to consider within their EJ process. They evaluated each of these indicators to determine if it could be used. Their evaluation criteria included data availability, data quality, appropriateness of the geographic scale, quantifiability, and the marginal value of the indicator. After their evaluation, 31 indicators remained. Cal Enviro Screen used a similar approach with similar criteria to select the indicators they used within their tool, and which best represents statewide population burden and population characteristics. To provide some context for our discussion today, we have put the indicators that are in both the Cal Enviro Screen and the New Jersey process side by side to do some comparisons on the following slides. Next slide, please. This first slide shows some of the environmental indicators in both Cal EnviroScreen and the New Jersey process. And it generally captures, the top part captures those that are associated with air pollution, including both stationary sources and mobile sources, with stationary sources towards the top and mobile sources towards the bottom. New Jersey has included a few additional mobile sources of pollution, specifically truck traffic, railways, warehouses, and goods movement. It should be noted that Cal EnviroScreen does capture additional indicators of health, specifically cancer associated with diesel and non-diesel emissions that are included under their health indicators. Next slide, please. Some additional environmental indicators on this slide show a focus on proximity or density to contaminated, hazardous, and solid waste facilities. The bottom part of the slide captures water pollution indicators. And again, you can see that New Jersey EJ process requires the evaluation of a couple more water pollution indicators than Cal EnviroScreen. Next slide, please. Some health indicators that are included in both of these tools. New Jersey includes 3 air pollution health related indicators from the National Air Toxics Assessment data, while Cal EnviroScreen includes 4 public health indicators: asthma, cardiovascular disease, low birth weight, and lead risk to children, which they just recently added in their most recent version 4 of their tool. Next slide, please. This slide shows some of the social, economic, demographic, and land use indicators that are included in the 2 tools. Interesting to note, Cal EnviroScreen does not presently include minority status in their tool. The housing measures are done just a little bit differently in the 2 approaches. Cal EnviroScreen looks at the percent of households in the census tract that are both low income and severely burdened by housing costs, while New Jersey considers the age of the house, with housing built prior to 1950 of concern. Land use and land cover data is included in the New Jersey process, but you can see it's not included in the Cal EnviroScreen. Next slide, please. Currently, we've organized our potential indicators into 3 general categories: environmental indicators, health indicators, and social, economic, and demographic indicators. Just keep in mind that we may end up dividing these into more categories or combining categories, but this is what we have started with, and in general, it works for our purposes right now. Next slide, please. So the environmental indicators are measures that tell us what is happening in the environment. They can help assess physical, chemical, and biological stressors that may cause adverse impacts to human health. Examples of environmental indicators that could be included in a CIA include the number of facilities that emit air pollution in an area or traffic intensity. Multiple indicators may be needed to characterize all current and potential environmental stressors in a particular community. Health indicators, next slide. Health indicators are characteristics of a population, such as the occurrence of a disease or other health-related factors, used to describe the status and trends of the health situation in a population. Examples of health indicators could be included in a CIA are measures of asthma or heart disease. Again, multiple indicators may be needed to characterize all current and potential health impacts in a community. Next slide, please. Social, economic, and demographic indicators are used to understand the characteristics of a community. For example, social economic status is an economic and social combined total measure of a person's economic and social position in relation to others, and is typically based on income, education, and occupation. Lower social economic status populations often experience the highest levels of pollution and have the least access to medical care, open spaces, or other factors that can moderate the exposures and risks from pollution. These populations are more likely to have exposure, sensitivity, and vulnerability to pollution, all potential impacts on human health. For example, examples that could be included in the CIA include poverty rates and the percent of the population that is either younger than 5 years old or older than 65 years old. Next slide, please. Now what I would like to do is explain the process that we're going to use to evaluate all these indicators that we've been talking about, and to help us determine which ones we would include within the CIA for air permitting. Next slide. It's important to note that all the indicators will go through this evaluation process, including the ones that we present today and others that we may learn about from you. So all of those will be included as we integrate this into the CIA for air permitting. Next slide, please. So we've come up with a series of evaluation criteria for each indicator to determine if and how it will be used within the CIA. This includes data availability, appropriate geographic scale, appropriate time frame, redundancy, and whether or not these indicators are quantitative or qualitative. As you can see, these criteria are similar to the ones that were developed for both Cal Enviro Screen and the New Jersey process, as we think that they're very relevant here as well. Next slide, please. Data availability is a key criterion for evaluating our indicators. If data are not consistently available in an indicator, that indicator will be difficult to include within the CIA. For example, surface water discharge is an environmental indicator that may impact human health. However, localized surface water contamination data may not be available for the use in the CIA. Although localized contamination data may not be available, the potential health effects of surface water discharge may still be considered in the CIA, but just more qualitatively, by evaluating the proximity of the discharge facility or the location to the proposed facility or development. Next slide, please. The second evaluation criteria is appropriate geographic scale. Much of the public health data from the Massachusetts Department of Public Health is provided on the census tract level, which is due primarily for privacy concerns. This geographic scale may not be as granular as we would like when assessing how pollution would affect adjacent neighborhoods to a facility or a development. In addition, some of the public health data, such as asthma emergency room visits, may include people from outside the area. These issues do not necessarily mean that the data cannot be considered within the CIA, but rather may affect how we include indicators in the CIA. Information may need to be supplemented, for example, with community input, or evaluate how to obtain more granular public health data. Next slide, please. The third evaluation criterion is time frame. This criterion considers the time frame when the data for the indicator is available and how often the data is updated. For example, the most recent National Air Toxics Assessment data for air toxics reflects 2014 data and may not accurately represent current air toxics exposures. Also, another example is while census tract level data is available annually, the more granular US Census Block level data is only available every 10 years. Next slide, please. Redundancy is our fourth evaluation criteria. Here we will be evaluating whether or not an indicator is being covered by another indicator, and therefore it may not be necessary to include it within the CIA process. For example, unemployment and income are both indicators of economic stress. Thus, it may not be necessary to include both in the CIA. The final criterion, and it's probably more of could be as a consideration, is whether or not these indicators are quantitative or qualitative. Some examples of a quantitative indicator would be the rates as a number of items within an area, or the number of people with asthma per 10,000 people. We may also use percentages, such as the percentage of a population with an income above or below a certain amount. Qualitative indicators may include things like public perception of the quality of community characteristics, which we may be able to obtain from public engagement. The impacts of some indicators such as prevalence and or proximity to green spaces and parks, which can affect quality of life and have public health implications. It's important to note that we plan to include indicators that can be assessed both quantitatively and qualitatively. And the evaluation process that we're using will help us determine how to best use each type of indicator within the CIA. Next slide, please. I will now turn it over to my colleague, Jonathan Dorn, and he's going to go into a little bit more detail on each one of the indicators.
Thanks, Lisa, and good afternoon. I'm Jonathan Dorn from Apt Associates, and I'll be presenting on potential indicators that we're screening for inclusion in a cumulative impact assessment for air permitting. Next slide. So first, I wanted to start off by reminding everyone, as mentioned by Christine, that there's a parallel process occurring under the Massachusetts Environmental Policy Act. The 2021 climate legislation directs Massachusetts to consider environmental justice during the MEPA process. A draft MEPA protocol has been developed for analyzing project impacts on EJ populations. And to assess the existing unfair and inequitable environmental burden, the protocol describes the following mapping tools and data as a resource. So the Massachusetts Department of Public Health EJ tool, as well as EPA's EJ screen. So the takeaway message is that the indicators presented during this stakeholder meeting are generally consistent with those captured in these tools. And so also, as mentioned in Christine's opening remarks, the draft MEPA protocol can be found at the MEPA website address listed on this slide. Next. So I want to talk a little bit about the purpose of today's meeting. And so what we're really going to be talking about are which indicators should be evaluated for inclusion in the cumulative impact assessment. So we're going to be brainstorming a list of indicators with you. Along the way, we'll stop and ask questions. And we will also be identifying indicators and discussing those indicators during today's meeting that will be used in the cumulative impact assessment. And so therefore, as we're going through this, we encourage you to provide feedback on any indicators that we might be missing, any indicators that we discussed that you feel are not needed, and which indicators you view as being the most important to include in a cumulative impact assessment. Next. So as discussed by Lisa, we will present indicators according to 3 general categories. The first category is environmental indicators. These are the indicators that are used to assess existing sources and amounts of pollution. The second category is health indicators. These indicators are used to assess the existing health of a defined population. The third category is socioeconomic and demographic indicators. These indicators provide social, economic, and statistical information describing the population living in a community. I will be presenting on the environmental and health indicators, and then we will turn it over to one of my colleagues, Holly Bender, to discuss the socioeconomic and demographic indicators. Next. So the first category that I will discuss includes the potential environmental indicators that should be evaluated for inclusion in a cumulative impact assessment. We have subdivided environmental indicators into 4 general subcategories that capture the pollution burden in a given area. These subcategories include the current levels of air pollution, mobile sources of air pollution, proximity to emitting facilities and areas of environmental degradation, and point sources of water pollution. The slide that we're currently on provides a list of indicators that represent current levels of air pollution. These include the criteria air pollutants, hazardous air pollutants, diesel particulate matter, other air emission sources near a facility, and facility-specific air emissions. This information is important when trying to assess the potential additional impact that a proposed facility will have on air quality. Next slide. So this slide provides a list of indicators that represent mobile sources of pollution. For example, motor vehicles are a substantial source of noise and air pollution, including particulate matter, nitrogen oxides, carbon monoxide, and ozone precursors. Exposure to vehicle-related pollution can be linked to asthma and other respiratory problems, cardiovascular disease, and death. Therefore, air pollution from motor vehicles and other mobile sources is important to consider when trying to assess the potential impact that a proposed facility will have on air pollution. Potential impacts could be that the facility will increase traffic in the area and thereby air pollution, or that siting the facility near a major roadway will increase the cumulative pollution level. The potential indicators for mobile sources of air pollution listed on this slide are the ones that we are currently have identified. They include major roads and traffic data, the non-major roads, railways, airports, buses and transit stations, ports, warehouses, and distribution centers. Next slide. There are potential health effects that come from living near emitting facilities or areas of environmental degradation. For example, particulate matter can be released into the air from a power plant during electricity generation. Additionally, the presence of solid waste sites can produce odors and pollutant exposures that affect the health and quality of life of nearby residents. Therefore, the proximity of these areas or facilities should be considered in the cumulative impact assessment. This list on this slide presents the current facilities and areas that we have identified as potential indicators. Data on most of these indicators are available in the Massachusetts Department of Public Health EJ tool. Again, this is consistent with the draft MEPA protocol that includes a step where the proponent should consult the DPH EJ tool to survey other potential sources of pollution within the boundaries of the EJ population. Next slide. So this slide, we talk about the point sources of water pollution. So point sources of water pollution are also important to consider in the cumulative impact assessment because they represent another pathway of contaminant exposure. For example, drinking water contamination may result in exposure to contaminants even at low levels that affect health. These health effects may be similar to those caused by air pollutants from a proposed facility that is seeking an air permit. Therefore, when considering the issuance of an air permit, the cumulative impact from both the exposure to contaminated water and the exposure to additional air pollutants should be considered. The potential indicators for point sources of water pollution that we have currently identified are listed here. They include combined sewer overflows, groundwater discharge, surface water discharge, and drinking water contamination. I will now turn the presentation over to Joanne Moran so that she can open the floor to questions and feedback on environmental indicators.
Thank you. So I'm Joanne Moran. I'm the Deputy Director of the Air and Climate Division. And as you know, we are asking these questions that you've heard a couple of times so far that we're hoping you'll join in the discussion on what indicators we missed, what things you think are not needed, and based on your experiences, what indicators you feel are particularly important. Christine Kirby is going to join us, and also the Director of the Division of Air, the Air and Climate Division, Glenn Keith, is also going to join us in answering any questions or responding or and also receiving your input. We're going to try a new technique at this meeting. We're going to try an electronic whiteboard. We're hoping it's going to work. So I'm going to stop sharing the slides, and ERG is going to help man that electronic whiteboard, taking your input so that you can see everyone's answers and also can see a summary of the indicators, starting with these environmental indicators. So we'll see if this works, and bear with us as we try this new technique. So ERG is going to put up a document, which I believe has also been put in the chat box. Is that right, Maggie?
Yep, I'm going to send it right now.
Okay, so we're also sharing this document with you so you can download it and also put it on your computers. But as you can, hopefully you can see here, this is all the indicators that was on the slides that might help for some reference. And as you provide input either in the chat, we will type that onto this, what I'm calling an electronic, it's basically just a Word document, but electronic whiteboard. And also as you raise your hand, and also Jonathan, if you could also turn on your video. Maggie will also call on you if you raise your hand, if you for you to provide comment verbally besides the chat, and she will also give us any comments in the chat, as well as call on you to provide verbal comment to us. So
Hey, Joanne,
yes.
I just want to clarify that folks may need more time to think about this, so there is a public comment. They can certainly give us their feedback later too.
Yes, and as we did at the last stakeholder meeting, we will be putting all of these questions in a survey, and it will be posted on the website. So you can either, as you think about it more, or if you just would like to put your comments in written form and can put them on the survey as well. We will also be giving that opportunity like we did after the last stakeholder meeting as well. And there will be a link to that survey on one of the slides at the end of the presentation, and will be posted on the website. So.
Great. And we do have one raised hand from John Walkie. So if you don't mind, go ahead and unmuting yourself and.
Thank you very much. I just had a question in regards to the criteria air pollutants and diesel particulate emissions, and regarding the size of the particulate matter, if there is any designs on, and I know it's not necessarily legally required to monitor ultrafine particulate matter, but given the growing awareness of the importance of that contaminant, I don't know if there's a chance to get that into this list here of things below 100 nanometers, that size or smaller. And there are some efforts to begin measuring that sort of thing. Granted, we don't necessarily have a full network of that, so it might, in terms of the criteria, it might fall out in terms of the availability of that data, but if it could be mentioned and recognized, at least within these criteria. Thank you.
So that's a great comment, and we will definitely give that some thought. Certainly different size levels have different impacts. So thank you for that comment. It's very thoughtful. Oh.
Joanne, just a question back to the commenter, and perhaps he could put it in his comments about, he mentioned some efforts to analyze ultrafines. It'd be great to hear what his thoughts on what some of those methodologies are out there and how they're evolving. That would be good. Thank you.
Sure, I can put that in a comment letter.
Thank you.
Great, thanks, John. So we did receive a question in the chat. It says, is the CIA going to apply to new air permits and or existing air permits as well?
Glenn, do you want to answer that, or you want me to? That really hasn't been decided yet. That's part of the decisions that have to be made as we develop our strategy and our straw proposal coming up in the towards the beginning of the year, but that is one of the decisions. But Glenn, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, no, I was just going to mention this would apply at an air application stage. So it could include, a new air permit, but it could include, a facility that has an existing permit, but then they are applying for, a change in operations. And some of those changes may increase emissions. So the climate law does direct us to develop regulations for including the cumulative impact analysis in certain air permits. So it would be at the application stage when they're being reviewed, but we're not at this point thinking about looking at permits that aren't in an application stage, although that's something that, people can certainly comment on.
Great, thank you. And so it looks like Patricia Rocker, you have your hand raised, so you can go ahead and unmute yourself.
My question is about permitting, and I'm going to use the example that I have is I've lived in the footprint of the Salem Power Station for decades. Living in Salem along the water and also living over in Marblehead, I know that there's been many scenarios where they were closing it, restarting it, and bringing something else in. My question is, where I see points of source of water pollution, I'm not seeing there, or maybe it's there and I don't see it, is an understanding of the prior impact of the pollution that was in the water, as in Salem Harbor itself and further out into Marblehead, and what that impact has been. Is that part of the process to understand that before you offer another permit, or is it simply going to be a case of, since whatever this other source might be would be better than what was there, they would be permitted? And that's with the understanding that the population have been affected for generations over by the Salem coal plant. And that's, as long as the wind blows, people are affected by it, which is a large EJ population also.
That's a very good question. And certainly, some of the indicators may reflect some of that, where we have indicators of that quantify existing contamination, even though the contamination may be from historical practice. That could be reflected. It could also be reflected in some of the health indicators for the community. And then I guess the other question would be related to this: is how can these other past pollution be, quantified or incorporated? So that's a good comment. Thanks.
I actually would add, it sort of adds to one of the questions we had earlier from Lisa about what's the data availability too. So we're looking at, how far back we have data to look at. But I think Glenn's comment about health indicators is a good one too.
Great, thank you, Patricia. And it looks like Richard Reibstein has his hand up, so you can go ahead and mute yourself.
Thank you. Thank you for doing this. This is great. And I have two questions. One is whether you are concerned with just water pollution. You've got point sources, but there's also non-point source. And I assume you're also just looking at water quality. It looks like you're looking at drinking water contamination. But by titling that point source, it sounds like you're excluding non-point. So that's one question. The other question is whether you're going to look at noise. Noise is an environmental impact that disproportionately affects environmental justice communities, and there are complaint levels and there's ways of measuring noise. So I'm just wondering if that would be also something you would consider. Thank you.
Okay. And we've received a few messages via the chat, so we're just calling on everybody as the order that they come in. So we have just a comment and says proximity to bus or truck traffic parking or storage facilities, including distribution facilities like FedEx and Amazon. Okay. And then we have a question. It says, is there any reason that non-point sources of water pollution not included as an indicator? I imagine that it might be hard to get the data, but imagine there would be ways that can be done.
Oh, I'm so sorry.
Stacy, do you need a moment just to catch up on notes? I can read that last one again. It says, is there any reason that non-point sources of water pollution are not included as an indicator? I imagine that it might be hard to get the data, but imagine there would be a way for that to be done. Okay, perfect. Next one is, when you include point sources of water pollution, are you considering disposition of air pollution on water sources? I'm trying to understand how water pollution would fit into an air permit analysis.
It's a deeper channel.
Okay. And John Walkie, looks like you have your hand up. If you can go ahead and mute yourself.
No, sorry, I tried to pull myself back in line, let others who haven't spoken yet already go, but I'll just throw it out just for the bullet. Is looking at the context of the project in terms of climate risk. So if we're talking about an existing facility, whether it's an oil terminal or something being at risk for flooding, or a contaminated site like either a landfill, I'm thinking of former Wheelabrator site, landfill up in Saugus, being in a location that could be very much more so at risk than something that's not right on the coast.
The new one will.
So just on that one, I believe that MEPA is specifically looking at that through their process. So that, as I said in my opening remarks, that we are continuing to coordinate with them. So that's a good comment. We will circle back and coordinate with MEPA on that. It's a good comment.
Great, thanks, John. And then we'll move on to Audrey Horst.
Hi there, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Awesome. Thanks so much for letting us comment today. I have a question about the water. Are you going to be considering PFAS contamination for your water contamination data?
Yeah, I
And
think
I
on
have-
all these, on the water questions, as we look at these water indicators, whether they're point source or non-point source, whatever the available data is. So if there is data available for point source of PFAS, that certainly could be part of this. And then there's, I think the other question that someone was raising was how does this relate to an air permit is another issue. It's kind of a data relevance issue. It could be that an air permit proposal is actually emitting a contaminant that communities are being affected by through other exposure pathways like drinking water. That's one connection. The other connection is the possibility that, all of these indicators, even if they're not directly air related, are stressors on the community. So that would, again, at this point, we're trying to just evaluate what are the existing stressors on a community and what's the burden they are bearing, whether it's related to air or not. And then there's the follow-up discussion and question of how does this affect an air permit decision, which may have different contaminants and through a different exposure pathway.
Great, thank you, Audrey. Next, we'll move on to Mary Ann Babinski.
Hi, good afternoon. Thank you for the time to make a comment. In fact, the person before me just mentioned what I was going to mention, which was PFAS, adding that to the water, contamination through water. And because PFAS can also appear in the air. So this is why I hope that is included. And because if we're talking about cumulative and additional stressors, health-wise and otherwise, environmentally wise, we know that, and there are studies being done now, though nothing has been conclusive to this point. And I know in my community that there are a lot of residents who were exposed to PFAS over years in their drinking water, are participating in health studies to see what kind of impact it has on their immune system. Because if over many years of exposure to PFAS, and we know that's the forever chemical that builds up in your system, they have a weakened immune system in dealing with other kinds of exposures to air and water and whatever contamination, that may have an impact on, if we're going to add more and more to what they're already taking in, that could be a very strong reason to say, you know, another source of cumulative impact would be detrimental to the health of that neighborhood or community. So I would like to see if that's a possibility that we could include that, because there's lots of measurements that are being done with that cumulative data that's being collected on that now too. Thank you.
Thank you, Marianne. We'll go to a few comments that we received in the chat. Does MassDEP have comprehensive dispersion models from inventories that would indicate aggregate impacts on various communities? If not, additional air monitors for more pollutants would actually indicate the quantitative ambient impacts in different EJ communities. Okay, and then another comment.
Maggie, who was that comment from? Sorry.
Chris Aberg.
Okay, thanks.
All right, and we'll move on to the next one. So someone just wants to second the mention of noise impacts. There's growing literature on cumulative noise impacts on health. I will reference this in the comment later. Oh, I'm sorry. No need to read this out. We'll go to the next comment. It says, when there are multiple pollution sources in a small area, the practice in the past seems to have been to come up with an average annual pollution exposure. However, when multiple emitters, stationary and mobile, are functioning at the same time, there are considerable and frequent spikes that add up to significant impacts. Will these be considered in addition to averages? Okay, and we don't have any other comments or raised hands at the moment.
Okay, we're going to continue on, and just we were going to say this at the end, but I'd like to say it now because we're getting some great comments from everyone. But you know, our next steps will be to take into this input into our process to evaluate your questions and your input, and to evaluate the indicators and the process for how we're going to use the indicators in the consideration in developing our cumulative impact analysis. So this is great input, and we will be using it in our next step of evaluation of developing what our methodology will be and what will be used in that methodology. So for all of this input and the next two steps. So I did want to say that because we appreciate everything you've already said. So let me start sharing my screen. We're going to continue on, and then we're going to stop 2 more times for the other indicators as well. Okay, seems to have worked. And Jonathan, you are continuing on?
Yes,
Okay.
I am. Thanks.
Great.
So thanks, Joanne. So I'm going to now talk about the health indicators. So as previously discussed by Lisa, health indicators are characteristics of a population, such as the occurrence of a disease or other health-related factors that are used to describe the status and trends of the health situation in a population. The Massachusetts Executive Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs established a statewide Ej policy that was updated in 2021. Under this policy, vulnerable health EJ criteria are defined as 4 human health indicators that identify populations with evidence of higher than average rates of adverse health outcomes. These are included and listed on this slide. So we have childhood asthma, and this would be based on rates of emergency department visits. We also have childhood blood lead level, and this is based on the prevalence of the confirmed elevated childhood blood lead levels. We also have heart attacks, which are based on the average age-adjusted rates of hospitalizations for heart attacks. And we have low birth weight, which is based on the low birth weight rate among full-term births. Next slide. So furthermore, data suggests that outdoor air pollution, such as ambient air pollution or the traffic-related air pollution, are associated with the development of chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. In addition, infant mortality and cancer are both indicators that help evaluate whether a community is already being impacted by existing stressors. So much of the data for these health indicators are available through the Massachusetts Environmental Public Health Tracking Tool. For example, the tracking tool has cancer cases by cancer type and compares the cases in a given geographic area to the statewide average. This enables one to understand whether a community may be experiencing higher than average rates of cancer or other health outcomes, and whether further information should be collected during the cumulative impact analysis process. And so with that, I'll turn it back over to Joanne so that she can open the floor to questions and feedback on the health indicators.
Further input on these indicators? So if anyone would like to put anything in the chat in terms of if we missed anything, or if you think none of the, if you think any of these are not needed, or based on your experience, which of these indicators do you think are particularly important for this effort? Or raise your hand. And it looks like there's a raised hand, Maggie.
Richard Reibstein.
Yes, I just briefly wanted to ask if you might consider looking at tree cover as well. Tree canopy is easily obtained. Presence of trees is important to health. And if you might be able to consult maps of food deserts so that you can tell people are easily getting the nutrition that they need. Those are crude measures, but they are possibly good indicators. Thank you again.
Great, thank you.
Just a note, this is Holly Bender. We have a couple of those indicators that we've included under demographic indicators. So we'll get there to some of those.
Great. And we have a comment from Paulina Casasola. She's noting COVID rates. And then Betsy Sowers has asked us to please add neurological disease, premature births, and diabetes. And then it looks like we have Patricia Rocker with her hand raised.
I was going to ask, sorry, I was going to ask about diabetes, but somebody just mentioned that. Thank you.
Okay, great.
Well, it's also don't hesitate to add, because, you know, it's important to know if more than one person thinks that as well.
Great. And then moving on to a few more comments in the chat. John Walkie wants us to add obesity, dementia rates possibly. Trish Settles would like us to add educational attainment. And then a comment from Andre Horst, overall mortality rate. Okay, no other comments or raised hands at the moment.
Okay, great.
We do have one more. Sorry. Pallavi would like us to add, how about mental health? An additional comment from Trish Settles, free school lunch. One more comment from Stacy Rubin, neurodevelopment disorders such as ADD and ADHD. Okay, it looks like it's the last of the comments and no other hands are raised.
Okay, great. I'm gonna go back to sharing. There we go. And we are now turning it over to Holly Bender from App Consultants. Holly, you muted.
Sorry, I didn't push both buttons. Hi, I'm Holly Bender. I'm part of the app team supporting MassDEP on this effort. And I've been working on the socioeconomic and demographic indicators. We have 3 slides that provide an initial list of these socioeconomic and demographic indicators. Again, the purpose is to obtain your feedback on these indicators, what we've missed and what is critical to include. The first slide here includes the 3 indicators that are identified in the state's EJ policy that was just updated in 2021. So EJ populations are defined as neighborhoods that meet one of these 3 criteria: low income, minority, and English language isolation. So for low income, the criteria uses median annual household income, and a neighborhood is defined as EJ if its income is at or below 65% of the statewide median household income. For minority neighborhoods, the criteria is that the neighborhood includes 25% or more of its residents as identified as minority. In English language isolation, also a neighborhood that includes 25% or more of the residents that are not fluent in the English language, then that neighborhood is identified as an EJ neighborhood. It should be noted too that not all of these criteria need to be met. Only one of the criteria needs to be met to define a neighborhood as an EJ neighborhood. All of this data is available from the census and the Department of Public Health EJ tool, which we're actually going to do a live demo. So we'll take a quick look at that at the end of the presentation. Next slide, please. Other socioeconomic and demographic indicators that we are considering for inclusion in the CIA include those listed here, as well as on the next slide. These are indicators of economic and social stress affecting the ability for people to manage and cope. Polluting facilities can be concentrated in communities that already face additional socioeconomic and demographic challenges, such as higher levels of stress stemming from unemployment, high rates of crime, for example. Populations that include immigrants or foreign-born populations, single heads of households, or disabled face additional challenges and stressors. These factors or indicators can also indicate sensitivity to the health impacts of pollution. For example, young children and elderly are more sensitive to the impacts of air pollution, as well as to other environmental health and social stressors. The Social Vulnerability Index measures the potential to negatively impact communities from hazards. The Center for Disease Control and the Agency for Toxic Substances and Disease Registry developed the Social Vulnerability Index that uses 15 variables from the census to assess communities' vulnerability and resiliency to natural and human-made disasters. So we are considering including this as in the CIA as well. It includes 4 themes. So socioeconomic status, household composition, race, ethnicity, and language, and housing and transportation. Next slide, please. This slide includes other socioeconomic demographic, as well as land use related factors and health related demographic indicators. Again, these are indicators of potentially vulnerable and stressed populations. Polluting facilities can be located in communities that already face additional challenges to their health, such as limited access to healthcare and health insurance, substandard housing, a lack of open space or recreational facilities for physical exercise, for example, and poor access to healthy foods, as one of the stakeholders mentioned, the food deserts. In rural areas, lack of access to public transportation can affect the ability for folks to access medical care. These are all, again, indicators of socioeconomic and health stressors in a community. I just wanted to note too, as Jonathan noted earlier in the presentation, and as someone mentioned too, MIPA folks, we had some recent discussion with some MIPA folks considering including a couple of climate related indicators, and one that we're considering is flood prone areas. So it could be an indicator such as the 100-year floodplain or 1 in 100 chance of a flood occurring in a given year. I also wanted to mention sensitive receptor sites. These are institutions or facilities that temporarily or permanently house people who could be sensitive to air pollution and other environmental burdens. These include schools, daycares, long-term care facilities. These are another kind of proximity-based indicators that can provide information on sensitive and vulnerable populations. Okay, I'll turn it back over to you, Joanne, to see if we have some input on these indicators.
So put up the electronic whiteboard and see what further input we have on indicators we missed, or what you think are needed, or any that you think are particularly important, or any other comments you'd like to add to these indicators.
All right, we'll go ahead and start with John Walkie. You can go ahead and unmute yourself.
Thank you. I would recommend putting in something maybe similar. You mentioned, I think it was California had housing burden, and you may want to go one step beyond housing burden to, I don't know if there is some sort of measure that realtors use on saying what is a hot market, but typically for specific to the greater Boston area, it seems like that is something that brings on a lot of housing stress, as can attest to in places like East Boston and other locations where has been an EJ community for a long time, and then very quickly rents go through the roof as it becomes part of a hot market, and displacement, stress over displacement is really having a huge impact on a lot of the families that we work with, and that has a direct relation to a lot of their health outcomes as well. So there may not be an existing, like the social vulnerability index, there may not be a housing market index that appropriately measures this, but at least the rent burden, the housing burden might be a good measure for this for renters.
Great, thanks, John. It looks like Stacy Rubin also has her hand raised, so you can go ahead and unmute yourself.
Thank you. I wanted to note, really glad to see that there's a climate category that's being considered. I will just note for the flood prone areas, if the plan is to use FEMA data, those rates miss several rural areas within the states, and it's not forward looking, so not reflective of the anticipated flooding that we would likely to see in the future. So where we've got data such as Climate Ready Boston, would love to see that integrated into the the analyses, and that data particularly looks at both stormwater flooding as well as sea level rise, which is important certainly for our membership. Some other potential indicators to include are single parent household status, renter status, incarceration rates, and then also looking at the transportation cost burden. So the percent of income that people are spending on transportation throughout the state. Thanks so much for your work on this.
Thanks for your comments, Stacey. All right, so moving on to a few of the chat messages we received, starting with Audrey Horst. She commented veteran status. Pallavi Mandy would like us to add homelessness. Trish Settles said rental versus home ownership. James Regar said, how would a company have access to this information in order to produce a CIA? Or is this all provided by MassDEP as the analysis begins? Okay. And Trish Settles also commented foreclosure rates. Betsy Sowers said, under climate indicators, be sure that the latest flood maps are used, and please add heat impacts and heat islands. Okay. Pallavi Mandy asked, is there a way to account for undocumented populations? John Walkie had a comment, climate impacts also relate to heat island effects, which in a very paved urban center with low tree canopy, you'll end up with more ozone being produced. Audrey Horst also said energy burden, percent of household income spent on energy costs. Mary Ann Babitsky commented homelessness and shelter availability. Gary Waldeck commented, in order to put CIA in context, suggests generic non-burden CIA be developed as a baseline. Trish Settles commented, migrant labor workforce, H-1B1 visa perhaps. And then John Walkie said, just seconding the energy burden comment. Pallavi Mandy said, access to safe and reliable supply drinking water and sanitation infrastructure. Okay, there's no other comments and no other hand raised at the moment.
Okay. All right. I don't. Okay, I'm going to start sharing the slides again. You stop sharing? Great.
It looks like we do have one more hand raised at the last minute if we want to take this comment.
Sure. Why don't you express it? We can.
Sure.
Add.
So, Andrew Irwin, you go ahead and unmute yourself.
Yes, thank you. Percent of the population smoking, since we're talking about air pollution, local impacts, and smoking.
Okay, we'll add that to
As
the
a health
list.
criteria.
Okay, any more, Maggie, or is that everybody? We got everybody.
That looks like it was everybody.
Okay, great. Thank you. And thank you for that last comment. Okay, so we're right now I think we do have time. Holly is going to do a live demo of, so I'm going to stop sharing in a second here, but Holly, I think you wanted to give a little bit of an introduction before I stop sharing my slides, correct?
Yes, I did. Thanks,
Okay.
Joanne. Yeah, so we have some time. We thought we would go over a demo of one of these tools, but first, just thought that you should know there's a number of tools and resources out there to obtain data on many of these indicators, and we're going to be consulting and looking at these sources as we evaluate the indicators for inclusion in the cumulative impact analysis. And certainly you can do some research on your own. There's quite a bit of Massachusetts data that's publicly available through the state. So on this slide, you'll see we've provided links to 3 tools, the DPH or Department of Public Health EJ tool. That's the one that I'm going to show in just a minute. This has quite a bit of information, so I thought it'd be helpful to take a quick look at it. As Jonathan mentioned, the environmental public health tracking tool is the second tool on there. It has a bit more granularity in terms of the health outcomes data, and it also includes some environmental data. The Mass Routes tool is a screening tool for equity-centered clean transportation built by folks at Tufts. And that's a pretty mapping tool if you wanted to take a look at it. There's also a couple other tools, and I'm just going to drop them in the chat here. It didn't make it on the slide. One is what's called the Mass Mapper tool. It's kind of the main warehouse of the state's GIS data. And then the most recent climate tool called RMAT, Resilient Massachusetts Action Team Climate Resiliency Tool. So there's quite a wealth of information. So I encourage you to take a look at these. And just a caveat, I am not an expert on these tools, but if you have questions about them, you can email MassDEP, and the email will be on the last slide here, and we will find the right person to answer your question. So I'm going to go ahead, Joanne, and try and share my screen here. Okay. Can you all see my screen? Hopefully.
Yes, we can.
Okay, so this is the DPH EJ tool. And when you first bring it up here, kind of the default screen provides these 3 EJ criteria that I talked about, the socioeconomic criteria that are have been defined in the EJ policy updated in 2021. So minority, income, and English isolation. So you can scroll in and take a look at these block groups. They also have combinations of, so if a block group has met both the minority and the English isolation, it's pink and so forth. But there's quite a bit of additional data in this tool. If you come over to this little icon in the upper left and you select layers, you can view, and I'm just going to turn this legend off. You can turn off the EJ data and you can take a look at some of the other data. So for example, some of the health data that DPH has by census tract, you can look here and turn these layers on by census tract, and then you just click on the legend to see what exactly is provided. I'm not going to go through each of these, but I thought I'd highlight a couple. So facilities, air operating permits, they have some point sources where you can see where the facilities are located, hazardous waste facilities. There's groundwater discharge permits, public water suppliers, facilities with wastewater treatment permits, and so forth. They also have municipal and healthcare facilities, so long-term care residents and schools, some of these sensitive receptor sites as well. So there's quite a bit of information in this tool, and I just thought I would give you a quick overview of it. So hope that's helpful. I'm going to stop sharing, Joanne.
You're all set?
Thanks.
Okay. So oops, sorry. So just to wrap up here, I had mentioned earlier, what are our next steps with these indicators? We're going to compile the list that we have and add to that from the input from today. Use our evaluation criteria to determine if the indicators could be included in the CIA, and then we have to consider how the indicators would be used in our methodology for a CIA. That's going to be part of the process in the next 2 months. So those are our next steps from after this stakeholder input. We'd like you to know that there's further opportunity for input. All of the questions we had today on the 3 sets of indicators will be in a survey under a Survey Monkey. Here is the link to that survey that's going to be posted on our website. We did this after the last stakeholder meeting. You're welcome to record your input that you've already given us into this survey if you'd like it to be written down, or if you have additional comments that you'd like to provide or think of something further, or if you know of someone who didn't attend the meeting or who would like to give further input, please let them know about this survey to enable you to either think about this further and provide further input. This is a table of the different links and places where either you can provide further input. We have a mailbox for DEP as well as MEPA, where you can always be providing comments or input or questions, and that's the first link at the top. We have a distribution list that you can be added to if you're not there already. If you come to the stakeholder meeting, we actually add you to our distribution list, but you can be added to our distribution list by that link on the second portion. And MEPA also has a distribution list. And then we have the link to our website, same with MEPA. And then at the bottom of the screen is the survey link to the Survey Monkey with the questions from this stakeholder meeting. I'd like to just indicate, again, we did this last time. We have an evaluation when you exit the meeting. This will pop up on your screen as an evaluation of the meeting, so we can get some feedback on how the meeting was presented to you, whether you have any feedback on the meeting itself in terms of evaluating the stakeholder meeting, and any comments you have on how it was run or anything we could change to make it more effective in the future. So I just want to end with any final questions you have about our process or about today's meeting. So if there's any final questions before we end today.
Yeah, Joanne, we do have one. Are there any specific deadlines we should be aware of?
No, we still have a long way to go. As we said, we're not proposing regulations until next fall. So we don't have any deadlines that I think are, at least not on the DEP, MassDEP side. MIPA definitely has the comment deadline, which I think we had on the slide. I think it was the 16th of December, but that was on one of the slides. So MIPA has some very specific deadlines for comments on their regulations, but not on the MassDEP side at this stage.
Hey, Joanne, the comments are due November 26th for the MIPA guidance.
Thank you. Sorry. Thank you, Tori. Sorry, I had them coming in sooner for you.
No worries.
So.
The 16th would be today, so a little short.
Yeah, that's true. I'm sorry. I don't know why I had that in my head, but well, I thought it was December 16th. That's why. Okay.
Okay.
And
No other
who
questions
was
at
just
this time.
speaking was the director of the MIPA office. So that was Tori Kim. Any other questions?
Nope, not at the moment.
Okay, I want to thank everyone for participating. You're free to exit the meeting. We'll stay on for just a minute or two as you do that in case there are any other questions. But thank you very much for participating.